Okay. It is noon, and so to respect everybody's time and to give Scott as much time as he has to present, I want to just quickly introduce myself. My name is Carl Anderson. I work for Comprehensive Mental Health, but I'm here representing the Metropolitan Council of Community Behavioral Health Centers, or Metro Council. We are a member organization that represents the community mental health centers and mental health serving organizations across all of Greater Kansas City. So that includes counties on the Missouri side, as well as Johnson and Wyandotte County on the Kansas side. And we host these webinars twice a month, second and fourth Thursdays. And if you are not familiar with it, we do an annual mental health KC conference, which is coming up in May. And so if you will, at the end or towards the end of the event, I will put a link up for you to log into to get your certificate of attendance for this event. And then also I'll put a link into the Mental Health KC site so you can learn more about the conference. Registration will be going live very soon, and it's going to be a great conference. We hope to see you there. With that, I will forego introducing Scott. I know a lot of you probably know him, and his bio was on the sign up thing. I just want to say that Scott is one of my favorite coworkers, and I'm excited to be able to host the webinar with him today. And so I'll turn it over to you, Scott.
All right, thank you, Carl. I will get my slides up here shortly. I will do my best to monitor the chat as we go. These sorts of presentations are always a little bit tricky because I can't see everyone. I can see Carl, so it's good to see Carl's face. But we'll do the best that we can to make it interactive if you have questions or comments along the way. So give me just 1 second here to pull this up. So that ought to do it. I see raised hands, Carl. I don't know if folks have questions. Maybe throw that in the chat is probably the best way to
That's if you do have something in the chat, and I'll monitor that as well if Scott's not getting something and we need to do that. Unfortunately, with the amount of traffic we get on this thing, if we have audio and cameras on, then it slows down the quality, degrades the quality of the presentation. So we try not to do that.
We definitely don't. We don't want that going on. All right. So with that being said, I saw a question about motivational interview. So many of you know me. My name is Scott Kirby. I am a licensed professional counselor. I'm with Comprehensive in KC, also with Burrell, and train across the state still, and still get to partner with like the Metro Council and the Missouri, the coalition. And much of my training is around motivational interviewing. This is a topic that I would say is parallel to that, but I don't know if you've had those. And so from a book. Hold on a second. Looks like my internet might be. Carl, you have to let me know if I cut out or anything.
Yeah, you did for a second, but you're on.
Okay, all right. An article that led to a book that led to a second book and kind of got me going down this rabbit hole in the science of perception. And I've found this quite interesting. I think it's useful here, and I hope that I'm interested to get your feedback on it as well. This is something I did present at the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers annual conference this last year in New Zealand. Which is a very hilly place. So the title was fitting. Bigger the backpack, the steeper the hill. I found out that indeed those were some steep hills. So when it comes to perception and understanding how we see the world, I feel like we've long known and accepted that we all see the world a little bit differently. I don't think that's too earth shattering. We know that we see it differently. One kind of fun experiment that was done on this, I believe this game was in the 70s, maybe a little bit before that, but there's a pretty famous football game in psychological circles, this game between Dartmouth and Princeton. So this was before social media, before all the stuff we have now. But this was a very heated game. Two fan bases that didn't like each other a whole lot, and the game itself was quite brutal. It was a very, very brutal game. Lots of penalties. And after the game, both regions' papers were just tearing apart the other team, how dirty they were, what dirty players there are. And so some psychologists got a hold of this, and they were able to get some fans from each of the teams and have them go back and watch video of the game. And what they're asking them to do is, we want you to count the number of penalties. And not shockingly, the fans from Dartmouth saw that the Princeton team had about twice as many penalties as their team did. Those dirty, dirty Princeton fellas. And the Princeton fans, as they watched back the film, trying to be as fair and balanced as they could, well, they noticed that the Dartmouth team had about twice as many penalties as their beloved Princeton team. And when they had independent folks look at this, really the number of penalties committed were roughly the same. And so we know that people kind of see what they want to see. We know that if you already have a pretty closely held belief, then any information that supports that, you're going to tend to hold on to it. Any information that goes against that, we're going to be quick to dismiss that. I see this in the real world all the time. I have coached a lot of little league sports, basketball, baseball, and I've seen this. The darkness of mankind comes out oftentimes in children's sports. And I can't tell you the number of parents who feel that I am just holding their precious child back, their child who could be a star if only I would play them. And they tell me about all the wonderful things that their kid can do. And it's like, are we talking about the same kid? Because I could tape a ball to that boy and he couldn't catch it. And yet they see it as he's just one opportunity away. So we know this. We know that that we have our own perspectives and things. So that's not real shocking. But as I dove more into the research on this, what did shock me is just how many factors go into how we perceive the world, how we see situations, and that's what I want to share with you today as we go along. So when we just think of the art of listening well, this is a topic I spend a lot of time thinking about, a lot of time training on, a lot of time practicing. I am probably 15, 16 years into building my motivational interviewing skills. And a key part of that is being able to listen well, is to be able to listen in a way that other people would say to me at the end of a conversation, Scott, I really feel like you understand what I'm saying it is to be me. So we're not talking about, I know it myself, I've experienced it myself, but I communicate to you in such a way that you feel like I get it. So it's really that art of perspective taking. We know the elements that play into that. So being a good reflective listener, throwing in those listening statements to check in and make sure you're getting it, helping a client, clarify or expound on things. So we know that those reflections are a key skill in expressing empathy. That's one of those things. And I got to tell you, I have at times thought, you know what, I'm certainly not the best at this, but I think I'm pretty good at taking somebody else's perspective. And after reading through this, I now think I'm probably not nearly as good at it as I'd like to think that I am. So a story to kind of kick this off. One of the books that led me down this rabbit trail is a book by David Brooks, How to Know a Person. And that's not a clinical book. He was writing though about listening skills, and I was reading this with a group of guys that I do some work with. And in one of the chapters, so David Brooks, if you don't know, journalist, he's been accused of being left wing and right wing. I think he would describe himself currently on kind of the rightward edge of the leftward tendency, I think is his word. But he described how there was a time he was invited to speak on a panel, and the topic was systematic racism. And when he was invited, one of the other key prominent speakers was going to be an African American lady who this is her specialty. She's won awards, she's published papers, she's like an expert in the field. And he felt like the host invited him in thinking that he and her were going to butt heads, that there was going to be fireworks because they were going to disagree, and boy, it was going to be quite the show. And so the event came, and as the event unfolded, he noticed that really, for the most part, he and this professor largely agreed on things. Most of the points that she made, he found himself nodding in agreement. And, the things that he said, she didn't really throw up any strong opposition. So, as far as there being fireworks there, that was maybe a letdown for those that were hoping for a big drag out, knockdown kind of a fight. But he was left after the conversation with this nagging sensation that even though they didn't really, explicitly bump heads, he noticed that every time that he was speaking, there was almost like wasn't a look of disgust, but there was something about the way that he was saying things that he could tell it wasn't landing well with this professor. And he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Like, I don't know. We didn't explicitly disagree what was going on. So after a period of reflection and talking through it with some friends, one of the things he realized was one of the big issues was the frame of reference they both entered that conversation with. And for him, he was kind of looking at the topic from a 20,000-foot view. And he's kind of looking at the history and key moments in history and how things had shifted and policies and all that. Just kind of looking at the overarching story. And the professor really entered the conversation through a frame of reference that this is something that affects me personally. This is something that's affecting me, that's affecting people I care about. So very, very up close and personal, not some 20,000-foot view. And so what David Brooks realized was in that conversation, had he been able to stay in her frame of reference longer, to talk about the topic through her frame of reference, he thinks that they would have been able to have a much more meaningful conversation. They probably would have found places that they might have actually disagreed, but they might have been able to have a much more meaningful and purposeful conversation where they could actually discuss things. But because their frames didn't really match up, the conversation missed on a level, even though there wasn't this great tension between them. So I like that as a thought because again, as helpers in our fields, we are really trying to see the world through our clients' frames. And again, I think we try that. A lot of my efforts are to do that, but I want to go over some things that make this difficult, make this harder maybe than it seems. So first thing is a couple studies that are related to the sports world that I found a little bit interesting. So one study was done involving a women's softball players. I believe it was a college team. And what they asked of these women was they had cut out various sized circles from paper, from large to small, and they asked the players, "Hey, pick from these circles which is the circle that you think most closely resembles the size of an actual softball?" And so all the girls went through the circles, and each one picked the circle that they thought best represented how big the ball actually was. And after they'd gotten all that data, they looked at it and they noticed a really strong correlation that the girls with the highest batting averages tended to pick a circle that was actually bigger than the real softball. And the girls that were struggling tended to pick a circle that was smaller than the actual softball. And so even though a softball is the size of a softball, the players who were going well for whatever reason, they were perceiving a larger and easier to hit ball than the girls who were struggling, saw a much smaller softball, much more difficult to hit. So we're playing the same game. We are not seeing the same ball. They did some other studies like this related to tennis. Tennis players who are going well reported their perception of the speed of the ball was different than those who were playing poorly. The players playing well perceived the ball to be moving more slowly than a player who is playing poorly. The ball is moving really fast to them. On the screen there, we have a picture of a hoop of what it must look like when a player like Steph Curry, gets on a heater, and the rim just seems, humongous. Now, I don't know, on this call of 90 of us or so, I'm sure we've got some folks that played some sports. I was never particularly great at anything. But I do know what it was like to kind of go on a heater, to have those days. I've been on the golf course where I hit every fairway. Man, I'm just striping it down the middle. And then other days where, I'm trying to hit a parking line. It just seems like this narrow thing, and there's no way. And this all points to just the beginning of, man, even in everyday things, playing softball, playing golf, playing a sport, we are not all seeing the same thing. We're not experiencing it the same way, to the point that we would describe the ball. Our brains are picking it up as bigger than other people see it. So what's that lead us to here? Well, there's a quote, don't know who to attribute this to. I've seen it given to lots and lots of different people. No idea who actually said it first. Usually when you don't know, it's either, Abraham Lincoln or Mark Twain. But I think maybe this one even goes further back than that. So I don't know. So if you know who said this first, then you can let me know. But that thought that you do not see the world as it is, but as it is to you. So we don't see the world as it actually is, that softball for the actual size it is, but perhaps we see the world as it is to us. And I wonder then, what does that mean for us when we're working with clients, when we're talking to our friends, our spouses, our children? So I want to introduce this concept of affordances to you. This is part of the foundation of work for the science of perception. And really, this concept first came about by a psychologist named Gibson. And this Gibson was tasked with by the military to try to understand how pilots actually land airplanes. So how is it that visually, in a plane that's going hundreds and hundreds of miles an hour, especially landing on like an aircraft carrier or something like how do they actually do that? And so in that study, it led to this concept of affordances. And so here's a good way to just illustrate the concept as we go forward. If you imagine a hunter, now I apologize, I know many of you are probably not hunters. I'm also not much of a hunter, but I did grow up rural, so I'm hunter adjacent. I know hunters, but imagine a hunter sitting on the edge of a field, holding a bow and arrow. And so he's got his bow and arrow, and he's looking out over the field. Now imagine that same hunter, instead of having a bow and arrow, he has a high-powered hunting rifle. And so the question then is, how does that field seem different for the hunter with a bow and arrow versus the hunter who has a rifle? So thinking through like how is that different? What looks different? So a few things come to mind. So the range on a bow and arrow is relatively short. You're probably looking 50 yards and in. So for a hunter looking at a field, something that's 400 yards away, unless it's coming towards them, they're calling it in. It might as well be 10 miles away. There's nothing they can do to hunt that animal necessarily. But when you add in a rifle, the range of the field looks different. You suddenly have a lot more space to hunt. You're looking differently. What the gun affords you is different than what the bow and arrow affords you. Now, on the negative side of that, with a bow and arrow, you probably can be a little less careful if you shoot over a target than say with a rifle, because again, the arrow's just not going to go that far. Where again, a bullet is going to travel much further. So each of those tools, there's a different affordance. So tools have affordances. There's the old saying that if you have a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. There's some truth to that. That the way we design items, the abilities of an item affect how we see the world. This has been replicated in a study where they were testing on police officers, and they were showing them ambiguous pictures where the person in the picture was reaching for something, holding something, and it just isn't real clear what they're doing. And what they found was that when police officers were holding a gun, looking at those images, versus when they were just holding a benign object like a shoe, that when they looked at those images while holding a gun, they were much more likely to see and interpret the pictures they were looking at as other people holding weapons. So just the very fact that they were holding a gun made it more likely that they interpreted what they saw as somebody else holding a gun, versus if they were just holding a shoe and saw these images, they were much more likely to see that person holding something else that was benign. So the tools with the things that we have in our hands, the tools we have at our disposal, they can impact we see and take in the world. So here is a second example of these affordances. I think my internet got weird there for a second, but hopefully we are back in business. So here's an example of an affordance. There's your first one. So there's a door, and that door, if you're walking up to it, you look at that, and very quickly you know, okay, that is a push door. I'm going to push on that door, and I'm going to get out of this building. And then you have this second door, and you're like, oh baby, yeah, that one's obvious too. It even has a little sign there. When I see that handle on a door, I know that is a pull door. So that handle affords me the ability to pull open the door. And then you get this abomination, which has pull handles but a push sign. And that's a door where you might just be stuck outside for hours. Where my chiropractor is, this is their door. It's exactly what it looks like. And even though I've been there over the last 10 years, 20 times at least, pretty much every time that I go up to that door, I push it. At first, I try to pull it open, and I'm like, what the heck? And then it's like, oh yeah, this is a push door, not a pull door. So we try to design items to where their affordances are clear, where we can look at things and we can make sense of them by how they look. So that first thing here is items have affordances, but also our bodies, people have affordances, animals have affordances. So I'm going to show you this little clip now. When we tested this earlier, the volume was a little loud, so just be prepared to be startled. This is a big old bull, thousands of pounds of muscle, and he is going to take a look at this creek, and in his graceful athleticism, well, just watch. One more time. Now that is an animal with some hops right there. That is an impressive feat. That animal, with its strength and agility, views that creek, and because of its abilities, that affords it the opportunity to just hop that sucker, no problem at all. But I want to show you, if I can get it to move here. Nope, stop it. Here's some footage of me as a young boy and my athleticism. And I decide that I am also going to gracefully fly over a creek.
I can't do it.
So not the same affordances for young Scott Kirby there trying to fly over the creek. I'm sure there's something to be said about the thought right before the jump, the verbalization of I'm not going to do it, and in fact, no, we didn't. We made it about a foot and a half into that sucker. But based on the affordances of both, the bull with its abilities flew over that creek, no problem. Young me with my abilities landed about halfway in, and now I'm probably going to have to do some explaining to my mother. So yes, sounded like a much better idea in our heads. So this idea, this concept of affordance. Um, in this picture, we have a dog and some humans walking along. And so again, just to kind of point out how the different people in this image, how they take in the scene. You know, maybe this is a couple that this is land they're looking at. They are wanting to build a home to retire in. They've raised their kids, and so they're surveying the land, thinking about where can we place a house and all those things. And to the dog, these people are missing all the good stuff. They're missing all the smells. They're missing all the things that a dog would be because of the dog's acute smelling. It's taking in this scene in a very different way than the human beings who are walking through and what they're thinking about. And then if you think a bird enters the picture, well, the bird in this scene is going to see affordances that are out of reach for the dog or the human beings. It's going to fly to the top of the trees. It's going to so it's almost like there's all these different levels of opportunity in this picture based on the abilities of the people and the creatures involved in the scene. So that's what we're talking about with these affordances. It's really a relationship between embodied people and animals with an environment, and then what their abilities and capabilities afford based on the opportunities presented in that environment. One other example of affordances here. And there are also, so if there are objects have affordances and people have affordances, then we also have some affordances that are social in nature. I can't remember now if this is Harvard or Yale. I feel like it's Harvard, but I could be wrong. But if you just think about this school, very nice school, tough to get into. Think about how different it is to walk on that campus if you are a student versus if you are somebody who just happens to live near there and you're cutting through campus to walk to your job. You know, so the person who's just walking through, it's going to be pretty obvious that they don't really belong in the same way. Most of those buildings are going to have places where you have to badge into to get into the building. You have to have your student pass, and so the person from the neighborhood walking through, they are not afforded the same opportunities. They may view that school very differently versus a student who is walking through school. They have a badge. I've got my backpack that says, you know, Harvard on it. I belong here. I can get into the cafeteria. I can get into the library. And then even more so, a faculty student, someone who works there with the ability, you know, to park in certain places. So socially, there are different affordances based on our status, based on our standing in certain ways. And then, of course, there are affordances that are related to the difference between in our society between being a man and a woman. There are certain things that men seem to be able to get away with that are afforded to talk a certain way, that if women do the same, society talks about them differently. We see this between races at times where, you know, certain, if you meet one racial profile and do something, it's viewed very different culturally. So this idea of affordances, it's kind of a complex thing. And it's some of what plays into how we, when we're talking to somebody, how they're seeing a scene and how we're seeing it, very, very different. As we're an employee working at a place, and here comes a client in off the street that feels like an outsider, that's already different. And then we throw in all these other mixtures of abilities and demographics and things. So keep in mind this concept of affordances and how it can play into our perception. but this does play in. I want to shift gears just a little bit now, and I want to talk about some of the early experiments they've done, just trying to understand, okay, how is it that we develop perception? How is it that our brains learn to make sense of the world around us and the things that we see? And on your screen, you're seeing a diagram that looks like some sort of a torture device called the kitten carousel. The kitten carousel, this was an experiment that was done in the 60s. I'm pretty sure it's unethical to do it today. So do not try this at home. Do not recommend it. And yet it has been done. So let's talk about it. So what we have here are kittens that were reared in the darkness. So these cats from birth were kept in a dark room and were not exposed to any light until they got brought to the kitten carousel. And what they would do is one of the kittens would be placed in a little harness, the one on the right there, where its head would be in the harness and its feet would be on the ground. And the other kitten would be put in a little carriage there where its head is out, but it's in a little contraption where its legs are not touching the ground. It's just kind of along for the ride. And so didn't take long before the cat whose feet were on the ground, it started pushing, and there you go, they're going in circles. And both cats saw the exact same sight, right? They're looking at the same wall. I don't know if they had put pictures of things up or threw a little catnip. It looks like a pretty boring wall there. But they visually, they had the exact same visual stimulation. And after this experiment, they interacted with the kittens to kind of see what had happened. And what they found was that the kitten who had been in the carousel, who did not have its feet on the ground, it really struggled in real world things. They would like roll a ball to it. And even though the ball is getting closer to it, it didn't respond. And it like, smokes the cat right in the head. It's like playing catch with my mom. It's like, did you even see the ball coming? And the problem was the cat did see the ball coming, but it had never learned to put together what to make of that visual information it was getting. But the cat that had self-propelled, the cat that had self-actualized, I push my feet. When I'm doing something, the whole world's moving. There was something about that cat having that autonomy, that ability to move, that helped its brain make sense of what it was seeing. So we got to see some parallels there. I have teenage children. I don't know those of you who've had children. If you've had a kid who goes from not a driver to being a driver, one of my sons loved being a passenger and was a really great passenger. And when he got his license, he found out he didn't know how to get anywhere. He could, without Google Maps, he couldn't get to the store that was 3 blocks away because he'd never paid attention to directions, because why should he? He's just the passenger. He's not the one that's driving. So there seems to be something about we have to be in a world where our attempts to do things, we get to experience that produces a result for our brain to really conceptualize that, really make sense of it. We have to experience it a lot of times before we can know it. Second experiment, the old sticky mittens experiment. Sticky mittens experiment. So this was done with 3-month-old babies. So those of you who've not had babies, maybe those of you have, just a reminder, maybe you've forgotten those years due to the lack of sleep and psychosis. But 3 months old are kind of at that place where they start to reach out for things, but their hand dexterity is not great. So they really have trouble picking up items. They can't really manipulate them. Then they just kind of bat them around. So what they did was they had 2 groups. Both groups got mittens. The control group got mittens with no Velcro on them, and the other group got mittens with Velcro, and all the toys had Velcro on them. And they had about 2 hours of playtime total, where the parents were to encourage the kids to try to reach out and mess with the items. And so what they noticed was that the kids who had the sticky mittens, they did a lot more active reach out play as the item stuck to their mitten than those who would see a toy, reach out, bat at it, but they couldn't really pick it up. They couldn't really do anything with it. What was really interesting to the researchers was 12 months later, from that 2 hour practice session, the kids who had the sticky mittens were still engaging in a lot more of that self directed play, that exploratory play where they would reach out for items because they learned that if I reach out because of these mittens, this thing's going to stick to my hand. And now I'm able to manipulate this object. So through my efforts, I'm able to make something happen. And that stuck in their brain in a way that the kid who's reaching out with the mittens and couldn't really do anything with the item kind of quickly stopped reaching out for the item because it's like, well, why even try? I can't really do anything with it, so I'm going to do something else. So again, we see some aspects of when, especially when we're developing, if our efforts lead to reactions, responses, that helps our brain perceive and learn what we can do in the world in a way that if we reach out and nothing happens, our brain does not make that connection. I wonder if there's any crossover to that in some of the work that we do. We'll maybe explore that here in a minute. Final experiment. Some of you have probably seen this before. This is the visual cliff experiment. Karen Adolph is the one who's most famous for all the work she did in this area. And with the visual cliff, you can kind of see in the diagram how that works, but there's a box at some height, and then there's a glass enclosure that covers a space where it looks like to the child, if they cross over the edge, they would fall down. And so it's the appearance of this visual cliff, but the glass keeps them safe. And so they've done a lot of experiments with this. And what they found was that as kids are first learning to kind of sit up, they're able to kind of sit up and have a little bit of muscle control. When they first start learning to sit up, if you put them on the edge of the visual cliff where the hangover is right there and you put mom on the other side, those kids will tumble right over that sucker. They reach over and go right out onto the glass. They don't even think about it. But after a kid has been sitting for a while and likely has bumped its head a few times, you take that same kid who's mastered sitting and you put them on the edge, they will no longer reach over, fall over the edge. They have learned what that distance means to them when they're sitting, so they don't do it anymore. But that same kid, as soon as they go from sitting to crawling, as that child is first starting to crawl, even though in the sitting position it won't dump itself over the edge, when they're first learning to crawl, they go right over the edge again, just like it didn't even matter. Yet when they master crawling, again, you put them on the edge and mom's over there with her hands out and the baby will not, it may be crying, it wants to cross the ledge, but it won't because somewhere along the way crawling, they've learned, hey, I remember that time I went down the steps. That was a bad deal. I'm not crawling over this thing. I have learned distances like this are bad for me. And yet that same child, when it first starts to learn to walk, it's up on the couches and it starts to cruise around a little bit, and we start to get those first steps. That same kid who knows when they're crawling, not to go over the edge, when they're first learning to walk, they fall right off that edge. They walk right off it like it's not even there. And so the question is, why does the kid recognize the danger as it masters some of the other forms of travel, but with each new way of moving, it has to learn it again? And what the scientists have discovered is, these infants aren't learning some objective truth about what 20 centimeters is, what a 2-foot drop is. They're learning, what does this mean to me? When I'm crawling, I figure out that a drop like this is bad. But they have to relearn that when they're walking, as they're learning to interpret the environment as it means to them. I've experienced this in New Zealand. We were in Christchurch for several days. We didn't have a car the first several days. We walked about a 6-mile radius. We walked a lot. I knew the city well by foot. On the last day of the forum, we went and rented a car because we were going to drive around the island some after the training was over. And I found myself driving back into the city and I was getting lost. This area that I knew so well on foot, in the car, I really struggled to make sense of where I was. And it's because the affordance was different. The affordance of driving a car, I was going at much faster speeds. I was taking different routes, and it took me a while to kind of make sense because I had a different affordance from a walker compared to when I was driving a car. So I find that stuff kind of interesting. Just knowing again that we're learning what the world is to us more so than we're just learning these objective facts about things. So this brings us to a portion of the program where we're gonna have ask you to get active here. I'm gonna ask you to get active in the chat. Some of the seminal work in perception theory has to do with hill steepness, and we'll talk about some of those experiments. So what I'm going to do here in a moment is I'm going to show you a picture of a hill, and using your best estimation skills, I want you to try to guess what angle you think the hill is at. So we're not looking for slope. Those of you who know slope and are bike riders or road graders, I want you to guess what angle do you think the hill is at? Is it a 5% angle? Is it a 90% angle? So just take your best guess. Now, these pictures haven't been doctored. I did not pick them in a way to make them try to fool you. These are just, they just are what they are. So I'm going to pull up the first one. And when you think you have a guess of the steepness of this hill in degrees, go ahead and put that in the chat. So here is our first hill. There's our first hill. And go ahead and guess what degree do you think that hill is at? All right, seeing some good guesses coming in there. You know, it would be a rough neighborhood to live in on a snow day. We can say that with great certainty. Okay. Good. Appreciate the answers coming on. We're going to hold up. We'll come back to these answers in just a second. Now, before I have you look at this next hill, oh, I hit the wrong button here. Hold on one second. Yep, my apologies. There we go. Before we look at this next hill, I want you to listen to this song for just a second. Hold on, the song is not playing. So I'm going to stop this share. I'm going to reshare so that you can hear my sound. Here we go. Take two, maybe. Let this wash over you.
When your day is long and the night is yours alone. When you're sure you've had enough of this life, hang on. Don't let yourself go, 'cause everybody cries.
Okay. So time for hill number 2. As REM reminds us that everybody hurts. Everybody hurts sometimes. So now, using your best skills, how steep do you think that hill is? This is a hill in San Francisco. Rough one to drive, rough one to walk. All right. Seeing lots of good guesses come in there. Fantastic. Well done. Okay. Before we look at the third and final hill, guessing the angle on this hill, I'd like for you to listen to just a little bit of this.
I love the colorful clothes you wear. and the way the sunlight plays upon her hair. I hear the sound of a gentle wind on the wind that lifts her perfume through the air. I'm picking up good vibrations. She's giving me the excitations. I'm picking up good vibrations. She's giving me the excitations. Good vibrations. She's giving me the excitations.
All right, the answers are streaming in. Thank you for taking your guesses here. Brandy says, I'm not good at angle, but they all look pretty steep. Indeed, they are. Okay, let's go back and let's talk about the steepness of each of these hills. Hill number 1. This hill, wouldn't want to live on it, but the actual degree on this is 20 degrees. That hill is 20 degrees. Hill number 2, straight out of San Fran. This hill is 21 degrees, 21 degrees, 21 degrees. And then finally, the last hill of the bunch, well known as the steepest residential hill in the world in Dunedin, New Zealand. That hill is 23 degrees, 23 degrees. So as I look through the answers given here, you confirm what Dennis Profit, who is the psychologist who's done a lot of study on this, found as he studied humans' ability to accurately guess how steep a hill was. We are not good at it. Human beings are pretty bad at guessing how steep hills are. Now, the good news is you're not alone. We're all pretty bad at this. So he wanted to look into this, and he did a lot of studies on, because a lot of the perceived steepness of a hill is related to how difficult we perceive it is to climb. And one day in his research, a batch of papers came in from a group who suddenly were pretty accurate in their guesses on how steep hills were. And he said to his research assistant, how is this possible? What happened? Why are people all of a sudden good at guessing the steepness of hills? Well, what happened was they looked at this group who was suddenly accurate. And it turns out it was at the University of Virginia, and everybody who had taken the test that day were all on the women's soccer team. So every one of these women was an elite Division I athlete, incredibly fit. And so it seemed like there was something about the fact that they all had elite fitness, that something about that was related to them being able to more accurately perceive how steep the hill was. And so then this led into some other things. And so here are some things they have found that impact our ability to accurately perceive the slant of a hill, or that make us overestimate it more. So people who are in really good shape versus folks that are overweight. If you're overweight, we tend to overestimate even worse than those who are fit. Those who are traveling alone versus those who are traveling with a group, especially if they have close relationships in that group, the person traveling alone tends to overestimate the steepness of the hill versus the people in the group. They looked at folks who are walking unencumbered versus those who were carrying a backpack. And those that had a backpack tended to overestimate how steep the hill was. There was a day that he saw a young man who was pushing his grandmother in a wheelchair. And he thought to himself, this kid could just run up this hill, no problem. This hill's no big deal for him. But because he's pushing his grandma, it's a really difficult task. And for his grandmother in the wheelchair, this would be an insurmountable hill on her own, but she has her grandson, so it's a hill that she can travel. They even found that the music you listen to, if you listen to happy music, you're more likely to have an accurate perception of a hill than if you listen to sad music. A final thing they noticed, they had elite runners As they got ready to start their run, they were getting ready to run a hill, and they had them guess the angle of the hill. And then after 50 minutes of running, they came to another hill that's of pretty similar steepness to the first hill, and they had them reassess that. And the runners, when they were tired, all tended to overestimate how steep that other hill was, even though it was the same as the first. So lots of things that affect our perception of the hill. The hill has an angle. It is what it is. But if all 85 of us went for a walk, we would all be perceiving that hill differently. We would see it differently based on our abilities. If you have just eaten versus if you were hungry, that was another study with perception. They looked at the Israeli court that grants probation or parole from prison, and there were 2 times that you were more likely to be granted parole. And those 2 times were twice a day the judges stopped for a recess and had a snack. And if you were up for parole after the snack, you were way more likely to be granted parole than at any other point. And the thought behind that is it takes a lot of energy to really consider a case. And if you're hungry, you're not as likely to put the energy into it. So if you ever are in that situation where you're up for parole, you want to make sure that the judge has had a snack. And then the final thing they looked at was elite cyclists. And elite cyclists that were given, they were either given a drink that had sugar in it or a drink that had no sugar. So a caloric drink or a non-caloric drink. Those who got the caloric drink were more accurate in their estimation of the hills than those who did not have the calories. So just to kind of sum that up, when we work with our clients, I work in substance use mostly. That was most of my career, and they come in, and it's like the hill they're wanting to climb is recovery, is I want to get clean and sober. And I see the hill and I see them and they think, gosh, it's so steep, it's so hard. And a lot of times I see my job as helping them to more accurately see the hill. The problem is neither of us probably see the hill fully accurately. I'm seeing it through my experience, through my skills, through my support system, through what I have in my backpack that day. While my client, who knows what they're packing that day, what they've got going on. Are they tired? Are they hungry? They're going to experience that hill very differently. So again, even though the hill has a steepness, we all are perceiving it differently and in ways that we don't know. Now we're going to go rapid fire style here because we're about out of time and I haven't paced well. But just a couple more slides to hit on this that I think are interesting. This is a test. We normally would have watched a clip of this aquarium with fish going around. We'd watch a few minutes of it and I'd have you describe what you see. This was an experiment done with American college students and Japanese college students. And what they found was the way that folks described what they saw was very, very different. Both Americans and the Japanese students described the fish in roughly the same amount of details. But the Japanese students were 70% more likely to make statements about background, things in the background, the rocks, the sticks, versus the Americans. The Japanese were much more likely to speak to those background issues, where the Americans tended to just focus on the fish. The blue fish swam to the right. And when they studied that, there seems to be some connection just societally in a society that's much culturally is less individualistic, more holistic. The way that they take in a scene is just very different in general. Of course, this is generalization than Americans looking at a scene in a very individualistic society. We're going to pick out different things. So just even right that, as we're looking at an aquarium together, we're noticing different things based on factors we're probably completely unaware of. Sorry, my aquarium's trying to go. We don't have time for you, aquarium. Final little nugget here about perception and cultural perception. So in China, there's the Yangtze River, Beijing up north, Guangzhou down south. Beijing is a wheat farming. Historically, they grew wheat. Guangzhou, they historically grew rice. To grow rice, it takes a lot of effort. You have to share resources, water, and typically that's something the whole family does, women, children, everybody. In a wheat community, that tended to be, especially before technology, that was a heavy plow culture. And it took a lot of physical strength to plow the fields. And so in those cultures, women tended not to work. That tended to be male dominated work because of the physical requirements. And um, and it wasn't as communal. You didn't have to share resources in the same way growing rice. Well, fast forward 1,000 years, and we still see some remnants of those who grew up in Beijing, even though their families have probably never plowed a field. But some of the attitudes that come from that still exist versus we see remnants in that Guangzhou area, an area where it grew rice, just communally, the roles of women, the roles of children, how we share resources. Those views have been shaped based on, this is called rice theory, by the way. Thomas Thahelm came up with this. But just seeing how the product they grew has affected how they see things, how they think about gender roles and things like that. These are things well beneath our perception. So as we wrap up here, Dennis Prophet would say that in essence, we're all kind of living in a Gulliver's Travel kind of a world. If you've seen Gulliver's Travel, you know, as he went to different islands, on one island, he was a giant. On another island, he was minuscule. He did not change, but the world around him was quite different. And we have to understand that we are probably not the ones accurately seeing the hill either. There are things that make it really hard for us. And we got to get away from thinking we're the ones who see it accurately and we're going to bring the clients to us. We need to understand that based on a lot of factors, we're probably both seeing that hill differently. And it's going to take more work than just listening well to really understand where someone's coming from. If all I'm doing is listening well and then comparing it to how I experience the hill. And so that would leave us just with a few questions to ponder as we wrap up today. I wonder, when we're trying to listen well and gain perspective of our clients, if we pay attention to what backpack are they coming in with that day? What load are they carrying that's maybe making that journey a lot harder than we might understand? That's something to think about. I wonder if there are ways in our treatment. Is there a way that we can provide some version of sticky mittens, if you will, to our clients? Are there things that we can do, exercises that we can have them do that make it more likely that their efforts are going to lead to experiences where they can directly relate to, hey, I did this thing and I got some result? Because it's not enough for us to just say, hey, trust me, if you do this, it's going to work out. People oftentimes have to experience it, to believe it, to know it. So how do we set that up? I wonder, how does it affect you when you're working with clients to realize you probably don't see the hill accurately either? I know for me that slows me down a little bit to consider maybe there's more that I'm missing than I think, even though I'm trying really hard to listen well. How can we make sure our clients are the ones with their feet on the ground, that they're not just passengers in treatment, that we pull around the kitten carousel, but they get to be the ones with their feet on the ground, doing things that then are really sticking in a way that us doing them for them will not? And then I finally wonder, what would all this mean when we think about taking another's perspective? I ran us right up to the wire today. I hope you found some of this interesting. The book you could read, it's a book called Perspective by Dennis Prophet. I received no royalties from that, but I found it to be quite interesting. And it's helped me just to think a little bit more about how I listen and what I need to do to really be able to put myself in someone else's shoes. And so with that, I am done. If there are any questions in the chat that I can hit in 2 minutes, I'm happy to do it. But otherwise, thank you so much for joining in today and being a part of this.
Thanks, Scott. And I hope everybody noticed I popped the link for your certificate of attendance and the password for that in the chat. You might need to, it's in a couple places, you might need to scroll up to see it. But yeah, this was great, Scott. As you can see, everybody's very appreciative. I enjoyed sitting in on it and being the face that you could talk to during the presentation. And just appreciate you doing this. Appreciate you going on Fox 4 this morning for us, and look forward to having you back sometime in the future.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for being with us today.
Thank you. I'm going to leave this on. Scott can say goodbye. I'm going to leave this on for just a few minutes and block my camera out, and just so in case you need to still get that link off the chat. Thank you, everybody, for being here. We appreciate it.